So, hello everybody again. And so, Dr. Richard, I have to say that I have compassion because I know that I was talking, and one of the things that my mind kept going to was you, and I was thinking a lot of the things that I'm saying must sound really weird. Really weird to you. Yeah. So I have deep sympathy for that, because in some ways the conversation that we're having together is a conversation that's been happening for many years, and there are some things that sometimes you can say and that everybody kind of understands what you're saying, and that if you've never heard that, it sounds like gibberish or it sounds like nonsense. And so first of all, I want to maybe apologize for that. But I would like, if you have, I don't know how we can start the discussion, but I'm sure that because I was noticing reactions of kind of surprise and dismay as I was talking. I did not feel that in your talk, but I think it's also because your talk was quite straightforward in terms of the clinical question, in terms of the notion of consciousness as the problem, a medical issue that comes with technology. And so I felt very comfortable in your talk. So maybe if you can express as much dismay as you want, and then I don't know if that's okay, we can start there. And
Sure.
Yeah.
Is this working? Yes, it is. Okay, so I didn't know I was that transparent if you're looking over at me. So, I followed you partway into your talk, and
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was halfway or more than halfway, and then it got difficult for me, for sure. But there were a couple of things that I jotted down that you mentioned. You mentioned distributed cognition, and I've heard that phrase a lot around here, and so maybe you could say something about that.
Okay, so the difficulty that we find is that we notice that we humans, we are not isolated individuals, right? We're not just people running around. We actually exist in groups, and those groups seem to be more than the individual. There's something in the group which seems to be more, the whole seems to be more than the parts. And so let's say, and a good example, sorry to use always sports teams, but it's like the Chicago Bulls are more than the individual players. And you know that because you can switch them out, and it still remains the Chicago Bulls. It has a kind of existence that pulls people together towards, and it's causal. It has a causal effect on the members that participated in. So if you think of a city has a body, and it has people living together, and that recognize a common authority. And that common authority will actually affect you. You'll follow the laws, or you'll go to jail. You'll pay your taxes. You'll put up the trash out. And so that doesn't come from just you. It comes from the fact that you participate in a community, in a body. And so the question is, how do we account for that in a way that makes sense of the phenomena of this body that we participate in? And one of the things that we're proposing, or at least I'm proposing, is that there's a strict analogy, and I don't make this up, it's something you find in ancient writers from a very long time ago. There's a strict analogy between the manner in which your parts, so you have in you different thoughts, you have different processes, you have different fighting interests in you. You can have things pulling you in one direction and another. You can love your mother and hate her at the same time for some reason. You can have these different things pulling you in different directions, but nonetheless, you're able to cohere that multiplicity into one, so you can have a pretty much a single, at least a through line of experience that you can recognize as Richard, right? And the notion is that there is a strict analogy. It's actually it's a function, it's a structure that repeats itself at different levels, and that we can recognize it at lower levels. It's easier for us because we can see how in us we have these parts that come together towards one, but it's harder to recognize it happening at a higher level because we don't have access to the higher experience. Like, you're not a city. I'm not a city, right? I don't have access to that. And so the problem that people are trying to figure out is that how does it work? Like, how can we account for that? How can we account for the fact that, just the fact that if I'm in the army, you know, and the commander says, do this stuff, and then we do it, and it fits into this big structure that is ultimately going to fight a war, but the soldiers digging the trenches he's not at the level of the higher causality. He's doing a little thing, but he's participating in a whole, just like the cells in your body are not aware of you, but they're participating in you. And so this is this, you could say that that's the problem that a lot of people are trying to face. And in my case, it's actually, I'm trying to reconcile ancient languages of gods and of angels and of the manner in which people talked about principalities and how they would celebrate common figures in order to exist together, that this is a way to help us understand what was going on, instead of just thinking that every single culture in the entire world for thousands and thousands of years were just a bunch of idiots doing things that make no sense. It's like, let's actually try to understand it. And I think that some of John's work and some of the things that have been happening are giving us keys to make sense of that stuff.
Can you take me through an example of the levels as we move up hierarchically?
I mean, there are different ones, but a simple one is a way that like, let's say our society works. And so you are a person, and in you have processes that you have to unite in order to not be a schizophrenic or not to be a complete crazy person. And then you exist in a family that has a coherence and an identity that you can recognize, that functions together. Those families exist together in a city, and that city has authority over you and has a level of authority that binds, a level of authority to the extent that that city binds your families and your groups and individuals together. That city exists within a province, that province exists within a country, and at every level you have a unity and multiplicity. And so let's say it doesn't always happen this way, but you can imagine that at the federal state, at a national state, they'll be dealing with issues that, like, they'll dealing with the provinces as entities. Like, they will treat the provinces as entities which have autonomy and a will. And the same way that the province will treat cities as entities that have autonomy and will, and all the way down to the human person. So that's a simple example, but there are plenty of other. It's also not like it's just like a one-way system. They're crossing over of different allegiances, you could say. So you could be in a basketball team that's in a structure that the teams are playing against each other. You win a championship, then that you play against another team, and then all these structures kind of fit into each other somehow. We can recognize that. So you can recognize that the winner of a championship now becomes the representative of that district, and now plays against the other district, and you can keep going up. There's another example, but there's plenty of examples where you can see the levels stack up that way. But you can go down, right? So, right, your cells exist in your organs. Your organs have unity, but they're made up of cells, and those cells are made up of a bunch of stuff that has unity, and that stuff is made up of a bunch of atoms that have a certain amount of unity, and it just scales all the way down into potentiality, and it scales up towards the things that we're talking about when we use words like distributed cognition.
I guess it's the word cognition that I'm not clear on. Is the idea that the whole is greater than the parts, that there's a kind of an emergent property that comes into being as you move from one layer to another?
Yeah, we could say, you could use that term. I always struggle with the term emergence, but that's fine. But at least the notion is to recognize, for example, that you, even in terms of your own consciousness, like if you participate in a team, your consciousness will be modified as you participate in the whole. And you will have conscious experiences that you cannot have alone. right? So why do I keep using sports analogies? I'm sorry, people. Right, so it's like, I don't even like sports. It's the weirdest thing. And so if you've played a sport, you probably had that experience where suddenly you start to, the other players feel, or you have the experience that the other players are almost an extension of you, or an extension of something greater. And when you get that, like when you're going down, if you're playing soccer, and you kick, and the other guy's right in the right place, and then he kicks it back to someone else, and he's right in the proper place, and he jumps, and he hits it into the net, and it's like ecstasy. There's this, why do we find that ecstatic? Like, why does it draw us into celebration? You know, and not even if you're not the one doing it, just witnessing that draws us into celebration. And so we have to be able to account for that, and account for that experience. And so you could have that experience, and so you have that inside you as well. Like John talks about the flow state and these types of different states that you can enter into, where all of a sudden you're all the parts of you seem to be seamlessly integrated into a common thing, and it's like this, and it's this moment of bliss that you're experiencing as you're having it. But you can have that even in darker things. You can have it on the battlefield. Like people have that on the battlefield, where a group of soldiers, working together, enter into a kind of bliss where they feel like they're one. And then to take them apart is almost ripping them apart. Like it's like, because they have come into this unity. So I think that's, I'm not the one who uses the term distributed cognition. That's really more John's term, but I'm fine with it, like to the extent that it is. One of the reasons why John uses the term distributed cognition, he talked about it yesterday, is because I have no problem in seeing at least an analogy of consciousness in these higher order beings. Like that doesn't bother me at all, because I see it, because I think that ancient peoples were not idiots, and they weren't saying idiotic things, and that the idea of unified principalities which reign over a quantity of phenomena is something that just everybody in every culture has believed at some point. Like it's just part of reality. And so it doesn't bother me to think that, okay, yeah, use the word angel or God or some unitive. But I think, of course, as more of a scientist, you can't just say I believe in the gods. It's a little harder, and I know you won't say that. Or maybe you do, I don't know. But then it at least trying to account for the manner in which someone identifies with the whole, and will have a different experience than if he was just alone at home. Okay,
so I think actually the sports analogy works the best for me. And let's see if I got this right. Say you're playing a game like hockey, which is really a reaction game, and it's a fast game. And when the players are working well as a team, it's like they're acting as a single body.
Right.
And you can talk about the flow state there too. I mean, they're passing without actually thinking about it, right? So you're actually now functioning as a single body, and that's almost an ontological change from an individual. Although an individual could be doing that, in which case they're not being very effective playing for their team.
No, I think that's exactly right. That you've got the right. You're in the right direction in terms of understanding what it is we're talking about, and the idea is that is actually, there's a manner in which that happens. It's not arbitrary. There's a structure. There's a way you can understand it. And so, for example, one of the things that I talk about is the notion of common attention. Worship is the best word to use. Is that in order for a group to exist as one body to a certain extent, it has to have something that it elevates above itself, that it has in common, right? So if we're in a company and we're making whatever envelopes, like there has to be something above us, the making of envelopes, which binds us together, or else what are we doing here? Like, why are we in the same place? We're just a bunch of strangers. The difference between a bunch of strangers on a field and a group is that they have something, they have a purpose, they have something which binds them towards one. And that often, especially in terms of societies, will have to do with common origin, right? Something that you can recognize in time as being one. Same with the family, a common origin. But it can also be common celebration. So if we celebrate 4th of July in the United States, or we celebrate heroes, we celebrate things that draw us together, then we can find that unity. And so then what happens is that manifests itself in some ways. It will usually actually have a ritual. You have to represent it ritually. So it'll be like standing together, singing. It'll be looking towards the flag, with your hand here, like whatever. You have to have commonality inside towards a purpose. So what it can help us understand is things like church services. So one of the things that I describe a lot is that a traditional village would have a church in the center. The church would be the highest point in the village, which means that it was the common axis in which all the villagers could see from wherever they were. And they would be also the place where they would be baptized, get married, get buried. All the important elements of their life would be celebrated in this place, which is at the middle of the village and is also above everything. And so that common center, common attention, common thing that we celebrate, and so we go together, we sing, we do processions, we do all these things which make us act together. And then we start to recognize that we are one, we're a body. And the reason why we talk about that is that one of the problems we're seeing with the meaning crisis is that a lot of the secular materialists think that you could just dispense with that stuff, and that somehow we're going to continue to exist together as autonomous individuals that are moral. But what we're noticing is that it's not happening. Things are fraying, and that the suburbs are a bad idea because everybody just lives in the same space. Nobody knows each other. There's no common goal. There's no center of town. So you know your first neighbor, maybe your second neighbor, but for sure your third and fourth neighbor, you don't know. Or you may, unless you're like an exception. But most people don't know their neighbors because they don't have anything binding them. They have nothing drawing them together. And so the kind of secular materialist city planning, the way that they understand nations, the way that they're moving is leading to a kind of fragmentation where people are searching for things to bind them. And sadly, a lot of it is being not found in politics. And so we look to politics and we're like, here are the bad guys, right? Here are the scapegoats. If we could just get rid of these horrible red hat wearing MAGA people, then everything would be great. Or the opposite, if we could just get rid of all these freaks, then everything would be great. But that's right. So we're almost going back to like a pagan, like an ancient pagan practices where we're going to find the bad guy, get rid of them or put all our sins on them, and then that's going to bind us. We're going to feel like we're one because at least we hate the same people. Like if we at least hate the same people, then we feel like we're together. So those are the reasons why these, at least for a lot of the people here, I think these questions are so important.
Okay, so would you say that religion is particularly effective in forging these social bonds, a collective sense of identity? Is it the best way to do that? Because if the political way is deficient, what religion is particularly good at is through shared participation in ritual, forging that sense of a collective identity and the social bonds that go with it.
So, yeah, I do think so. And I do also, I think that because it has to do with the nature of that which we're celebrating. So the idea is that so Jonathan Haidt talks about this issue. Like he kind of understands the problem of unity and circumambulation around commonality. But I think also because he's a scientific, he's more rationalist, then he has this idea that anything could be there, right? It doesn't matter what you put in the middle. Right, as long as we recognize that it has, that it binds us, then that's okay, right? Or it'll work. But I think that that's not right. I think that the thing which you celebrate will bind in a particular way, and so that the forms. So a good example would be like worshiping the God, the eternal God of love, that is the source of all things, right? Is better in terms of binding us together in the way that is the most proper than worshiping the floating spaghetti monster. Because the floating spaghetti monster is an arbitrary, chaotic mixture of idiosyncratic identities. And it's like, so if we worship that, obviously nobody worships that, but like if we were to worship that, then it would cause us to be a certain way, right? So if you worship Mars, like if you worship the god of war, then you will act a certain way. You will be a warrior society. So the gods that people worship were not just arbitrary things they put in the middle. They were causal into the manner in which they bind. So a basketball team will bind you together towards basketball, but basketball is not sufficient to hold a society together. It is not a high enough good to make us exist, even though we try. Like people have tried to make sports, the Olympics is actually a desire to do that. It's like, let's make sports the highest thing. If we do that, then we won't have wars anymore. Like we'll all love each other. But it seems like it's not, and then religion has also been the source of conflict, that's for sure. But even in terms of, usually when it's especially internal conflict, it's at least seen as something which is deficient, that's not what it should be. But if you worship the god of war, then killing other people is what it should be, right? That's how it should go, because that's what you're worshiping.
Okay, so here comes a big one then.
Oh, that big one.
This is the big one. Can you enjoy the benefits of the social bonding through religion participation in religion ritual without actually believing the dogma of the religion? It's just participation in the social aspects.
Yeah, that's a great question. Why are you laughing? Because John? I would have a few answers to that.
Why are they laughing?
I don't know. Why are you laughing?
I'm laughing because everybody around me. I think they might be thinking about a religion that is not a religion.
Oh, the religion that's not, because John's trying to set up a religion that's not a religion. Oh, man. So I think that what you're saying, I think that that actually has always been the case. I think that the capacity to which we give ourselves, let's say, to the religious aspect, has always been a hierarchy. That there have always been people who completely are given to God and to the story and fully immersed, and that they hold the world together. Like that's the way it's presented. It's like the monks who live in prayer, they actually hold the world together. And that on the fringe of that, there will always be people that are marginally participating and that are not so sure and that don't really know, And so I think that let's say, if there are at the core those that are completely dedicated to, let's say, the God of love and order their entire lives based on this notion and worship of him, then those that are marginally there and don't really know or not sure, they'll be okay. Like they won't. The society can kind of hold. There's a way in which it can hold. So I don't know if that answers.
That's not bad.
Yeah. But can I have I want to also ask, can I ask something or are we done? Because I feel like I'm just the one talking. That's not good. Yeah. And so let's say in your case, because I understand you're a more secular person, and so what would you think would be the capacity that we bind together, let's say, as groups, as societies, as families? What are the things that draw us together to exist as not just individuals?
I would think common interests. Sports, obviously, would be good. Or even physical activities that people share. Participation in clubs. I mean, it's having a social life. And so that's why I'm wondering is.
But do you think there's a like they say, like the way I say there's a hierarchy of goods, that there's actually, let's say participating in a sports team will do something, it will, but it's not enough to hold a nation together, for example.
I mean, how about something like the Rotary Club, which is a service club where
Yeah.
people, like-minded people come and they do good things for the community. But there's no belief system attached to that. And so there are...
Well, they believe that doing good things is, like that, they do have an idea of what doing good things is, right?
Yeah.
Right, it's not arbitrary.
So they're donating their time to make their community better,
Yeah.
donating their time, often money.
Yeah.
But they enjoy each other's company, and so
Yeah.
they get the benefits of being a part of a group of like-minded people.
Yeah. So,
It's a
like in
good
terms of the Rotary
organization.
Club, that's a good example, because what I would tend to think is that the Rotary Club, let's say, at least secretly exists within something which was set up by Christianity. That is, the idea of self-sacrifice is not obvious. It's not an obvious thing that every culture has come to recognize as being the highest good, right? And so the notion that giving your time for society, for the common, is something which is highly valuable and is there to bind us together. It has a very particular nature. So if you look at warrior cultures, for example, then you have a very different vision. It's like the highest people are the ones that rape and kill and take and that accumulate. And if you can do that, then you have the honor. But the idea of giving yourself you might give yourself to your brother in arms, like because you believe in this ecstasy of battle, but to help the poor, like that's not an obvious thing. It's not something which is universal. So I would say yes, but I do think that it's still bound in something like a hierarchy of goods that we have to be able to see. Like, why is it that we think that that's good, the Rotary Club, what they're doing? And not, for example, I don't know, a group of people going around beating up immigrants. Because, that's an action that groups have done in the past, or, beating up strangers or beating up the sick or, or whatever, to kind of push them away because they're in the way and they're trouble for the good of the community. But those are things that have existed, goods that people have thought were the good in the past. But the Rotary Club I think it has a hierarchy of goods. I don't know if that makes sense. All right.
So the first question for Richard. Assuming there are levels of consciousness in the animal kingdom, and if panpsychism is true, all matter, is mere consciousness a sufficient condition for ethical consideration? Might there be a quantity or quality threshold, and is that already being assumed in the studies you mentioned?
Because there's a panpsychism question. Okay, so it's a good question as how far down the phylogenetic scale does consciousness go, right? And David Foster Wallace, lobsters. Consider the lobster. Wonderful, wonderful essay. Bon Appetit magazine. He did it so well. It's a simple creature. Think of a lobster as a large ocean-going insect. Fewer neurons than a cockroach. Is it reasonable to suppose that it feels pain? That's the important question. Switzerland has banned boiling lobsters alive. Right, so let's just to be on the safe side. But it's reasonable to expect that it would be a less sophisticated consciousness. And so as we move up the phylogenetic scale, there are almost certainly aspects of consciousness that humans have access to. The other animals don't, because we have the cultural programming. We've downloaded the cultural software, which is natural language, and the conceptual structures that go with that. That's going to give us a more sophisticated sort of moral character.
So for example, like the question in terms of consciousness, do you think that the levels of consciousness are sufficient for like I think that's also like recognizing consciousness in beings. It would be the ethical characteristic you would use to decide how to act on those beings. Because you mentioned that, where you said you don't boil lobsters or whatever. Like, so would be this scale of consciousness be sufficient to justify the manner in which we understand moral action in terms of other beings? So, right, the whole vegetarian question and all that stuff, where it's like, if I recognize consciousness, so therefore I can't kill that which is conscious.
Yes, okay. So I think a good basic principle is don't cause unnecessary suffering. Don't cause pain to sentient creatures. And then the question then is this creature sentient or not? Is it capable of feeling pain? And then you have a moral reason not to kill them and eat them if there's suffering involved in doing that. It's a moral reason for being vegetarian,
Yeah.
I think. I'm not sure I answered that question, but
I think so. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you. So for both of you, how is the relationship that characterizes consciousness and draws toward the good indicative of the nature of reality or God?
Just an easy question right there. It's like,
you're going to have an easier time.
yeah, we're gonna have an easier time to. So I think what I was trying to present in my talk is that I think that there is in at least the notion of attention, and that you find in the notion of attention the basis for understanding, let's say, how reality unfolds, and that how reality is related to necessarily to the good. That you can't avoid it. That all our category structures are actually based in a vision of a good. And that good isn't just moral. Like, it's just, like I said, like a good pair of shoes is not a moral question, but it is a question of that which draws into identity. And so the Christians have always used terms like saying that God is the supreme good, that and there have been many theological arguments about God as that, say, like the source of good, the supreme good, all this type of language. So I do think that it's interesting, at least to think about, how the question of the good embeds itself even in our perception, and so how high does it scale? I think it does give a direction to a morality as well, but then how high does it go? And I think that at least Christians will say, well, then if all these goods are embedded into each other, and we didn't get to talk about this too much, but the difference between the parasitic good, right? Because if you wake up at 2 a.m. to eat a chocolate cake, like obviously you're looking for a good, but that good is not embedded in other goods. It's like a parasitic good. Someone who shoots up heroin is looking for a good, but that good is parasitic. It devolves the being into less, right? Into a kind of narrowing of the good into something which is which will kill you. But that there's a way in which these goods scale up. So goods fit into each other. So if I eat a meal and I do it in love with my family, that meal scales into the love that I have for my family, and these goods participate into each other. So the idea is that all these goods fit into each other and scale up to a point where you could say the origin of all good. And that would be one of the descriptions of God. There.
Okay, so listening to the early part of your talk, there was something that struck a chord with me. You were talking about how we care for things. That's a kind of relation toward things and people. Are you familiar with Martin Heidegger?
Yep.
And were you thinking of the Heideggerian
Yep.
sense of, okay. Because that's, I think, a strong point of Heidegger's phenomenology is that our basic lived relationship with things and other people is one of caring. So we care about them, we care for people, or we don't. We don't care for that. And that's really kind of emotional relationship rather than, say, a spatial relationship, like the cup is next to the saucer in the cupboard.
Yeah.
That's fundamental. And from that, you've got the basis for an ethical relationship with other people and other things.
No, I
It's just
totally
really
agree. I use the word care, and I think I even mentioned Heidegger just in passing, but I think that Heidegger offers us a new possibility of understanding some things which I think became difficult to understand with just scientific rationalism, like just this kind of basic naturalism that described mechanical causes but didn't realize. And so what we're trying to do, one of the things we're trying to do is to, and I think it's all there, already there in Heidegger, which is that the care, right, is the manner in which, it's the field in which being actually reveals itself to you. So that's why I'm trying to bring care into the very categorization of things, because the identities of things, they shine to you in care. That's how you see the light or the unity of something, is because there's something drawing you towards it, and that is it's not a neutral categorization. It's actually that it has value to you. And so that's one of the things that Heidegger is definitely one of the sources. But I think that Heidegger helps us understand Dante, for example, or helps us understand a lot of the more ancient, or gives us space to understand them, because he represents being as this relationship of care. And so now if I say love, it's like, okay, well, love binds things together. It's like, yeah, and I think Heidegger was pointing at that, but you can have other ways of saying it.
Okay, we agree on something. We're
go.
really getting somewhere with this dialogue.
Can there be consciousness without love or care, according to that Jonathan's definition of these terms?
Can there be consciousness without love or care? That's interesting. I've never thought about that.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, go for it.
How about this? There's a hedonic tone to all experience. It's either pleasant or unpleasant, mildly or extremely so. So there's that quality, that hedonic quality to every experience that we have.
So without that qualitative relationship, we could describe as something like care, or because you want to get away from that which hurts you, and you want to move towards that which doesn't, like, it gives you more, or like, yeah. Yeah.
We agreed on another thing.
I have a question though for you, because related to the question of the Rotary Club. So, in a hedonic definition, let's say a hedonic aspect of consciousness, how would you explain something like self-sacrifice in that context?
Is there not a certain pleasure which goes with helping other people and collaborating with other people, doing voluntary work? I mean, it sounds selfish to put it that way, but I think it's the case.
So you would say something like delayed gratification would be something that someone could have or experience. It's like, I'm going to suffer for a greater good. Like, because if you train, like, I don't know, whatever it is we do, like we cause ourselves pain in order to get to something which is driving us. We don't always get pleasure from the immediate things we're doing, but we know where we can project a satisfaction in the future and be willing to sacrifice pleasure or now.
I think that's more psychologically complicated because it's a trade-off. So I'm sacrificing a short-term, smaller pleasure for a longer-term, larger gain. That still sounds awfully selfish when you put it that way.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I do think I do think ultimately the way it's set up is that the surprise you find, let's say you're lazy and you don't want to do anything, and then you're like, I don't want to exercise or whatever because it's too painful. And then, so it's like you do it, and then you realize a surprise at the other end. It's like, oh, wait a minute, like this is bringing me. And it's the same with, like, I don't know, your 1-year-old is done it in his diaper, and it's very unpleasant, and you've got to change it, and it's disgusting. And it's like, and then when that suffering builds up, and at some point you're like, wait a minute, like my child loves me, and there's this beautiful thing. And so we are, ultimately these acts of self-sacrifice, they do yield a greater good. But there's the weird possibility that sometimes you won't reap that yourself. So someone who jumps on a grenade, to save their fellow soldiers, they definitely won't reap that. They will. I think they're using the same structure to act, but they won't reap the pleasure.
In that case, you're talking about an organization which has developed very close social bonds. The military is very good at training people and putting them together, so that dynamic happens. And that sort of self-sacrifice becomes explainable under those conditions.
Sorry, it's supposed to be you guys asking questions. Sorry.
Oh, this is good. Richard, did the 1971 film, adapted from the 1930s novel, Johnny Got His Gun, have any influence over the theoretical or therapeutic understanding and approach to locked-in syndrome?
I'm not familiar with that at all. Anybody else?
I don't know what that is.
No.
Sorry.
No.
Interesting question, but...
Maybe we should watch the film. Jonathan, given your striking observation from Dante that heaven is other people, is something like the blessed
Which is the opposite of Sartre, by the way, just so you know that. If you want to see the difference between, it's the opposite of Sartre. Let's just say that.
Well, let me finish the question.
Yeah, sorry.
Is something like the blessed community the counterpoint to Sartre's thesis?
Oh, there you go. That's hilarious. So yeah, answer the question.
And for anyone who's not familiar, the thesis is in no exit that hell is other people. So.
Can't both of those be true?
Well, at least in Dante, that is not true. That it is in my disposition towards others that hell is found, and not in others. And so it is in the manner in which I encounter them that I will find my suffering. Obviously, someone can cause you physical suffering, but in terms of the real deep existential suffering, it's in that disposition, and that can actually help us understand some of the crazier stories, let's say, of martyrs or people that have been in horrible situations and that have found freedom. Or Solzhenitsyn is a great example, that has found freedom in trying to bring responsibility back into himself in the right way, so that he is not damaged by others. So that the idea of forgiveness would be part of that as well, where it's like, I choose to see the good in you, even if, as much as I can, and that is probably, it's going to save me too. Like, it's going to save me from falling into despair and into a resentment, which that's hell. Yeah.
Regarding sacrificing one's idiosyncrasies towards the common good, in the Abraham story, who is the exemplar of faith, and how does this relate? Or to put it another way, what was the good that Abraham was being drawn toward in love, and how is that faith?
So, in the story of Abraham, you have it's a very the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to understand. But it has to do with this. It definitely has to do with this idea of sacrificing the best, you could say, up towards a higher good, and you see that in Scripture a lot. And it would happen ritually in ancient cultures, where people would kill their firstborn, like it was actually not a normal thing, but it was a common thing. And the way to understand it is to understand that if you give the best of yours up towards that which binds you together, then that will have a causal effect on you. Like it will bind you. So you can think about it in a war. It's easier to think about it in a war because we still have examples of that where it's like these men who sacrifice themselves, and you have a statue. It's like, here are these warriors that sacrifice themselves for the liberty of Europe. And that sacrifice of the best of us becomes one of the binding agents which holds us together. So we have to understand that Abraham was dealing with that's what he was dealing with. So he was dealing with the higher order reality, asking him to give that which is the best. And I think that that's something which is, you see that in Scripture. There's other places where you see that happening. And what's being set up slowly is a transfer of that, like a transition from that into self-sacrifice. And so the idea would be something like the willingness to give the best of you up towards a higher purpose. The surprise that you find when you do that is that you get it back. And it's like, whoa, that's weird, right? And so the efforts, the willingness to sacrifice your idiosyncrasy, let's say all the effort you put into like giving up to a higher cause, will then make all those things valuable. That's what will make them valuable. So I think that in the story of Isaac, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the willingness of Abraham to give up towards the God at the top of the mountain and then getting it back. It's like getting his son back, you could say. And ultimately that will lead to something like the resurrection, like in terms of storytelling. It'll lead to something like the idea that if you sacrifice yourself, you get the most, actually. You get the most out of you get the fullest life if you do that. So to me, that's the only way I think it's the best way. I don't like Kierkegaard's, the way that Kierkegaard interprets that in terms of this like leap of faith into like an unknown moral whatever. I don't think that's the best. I think that this structure of sacrifice, if you understand the structure of sacrifice and you try to understand why people would sacrifice other humans, because nobody wants to do that. They just want to look at those old people and think they're a bunch of idiots. And like, I'm not advocating human sacrifice. But I think that thank you. I think that the blindness to trying to understand why those things occurred, that they could just be silly superstitions for thousands of years over the entire earth. It's like, okay, yeah, if you're really a secular materialist, you should try to find a reason for why that was maintained for so long. And I think that that's what we're seeing in this notion of sacrifice. There are two types of sacrifices. There would be sacrifice of the best, right? So you sacrifice your best bull. It starts with sacrificing your kids. You're the best. Sacrifice the first fruits up. And if you do that, then you get it. Then it holds the world together, right? And then the other one is sacrificing the scapegoat. So you cut off the thing that doesn't fit, chop it off, and that's how you cohere. So you have these two ritual behaviors, and I think that at least in the story of Jesus, they seem to come together and be resolved in that both seem to be happening at the same time. Jesus is both the scapegoat and the best, which is offered up at the same time. It's hard to think about it, but that seems to be what's going on in that story. And I think that's also, like I said before, I think that's also one of the reasons why the sacrificial system just kind of wanes and goes away after that. We're still humans. We'll still do horrible things, and we'll still kill the strangers or whatever. But at least it's in terms of narrative and in terms of story, it's not as pressing as it used to be for ancient people. Go for it. I want to hear it because I'm bringing you into very strange territory. I'm sorry.
I'm not sure I want to respond to this one. I get a feeling you're scratching the surface with this one.
In terms
I
of
just,
sacrifice?
Well, the Abraham Isaac story.
Hmm.
I mean, what kind of conversation would Isaac have had with, his wife's name was Sarah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how would that conversation have gone, do you think?
The what? Of sacrificing your child?
Conversation, you're going where?
Yeah.
To do,
Well, not if you're in a world where sacrificing your firstborn is something that's common. Because we have this weird idea that somehow that story is an exception. But the sacrificing of children is something that happened in most cultures at some point. Human sacrifice is one of the human universals. So we have to actually understand that. I think that our failure to try to understand why human sacrifice developed is a great blight on us, because what's going to happen is we're going to do it again. And we do, and we don't realize it. It's like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were presented explicitly as human sacrifice. They said, we're going to kill these innocent people to save all these other people. And we're going to do it on purpose. We're going to kill innocent people, thousands and thousands and thousands of them, because we believe that if we do that, the world will cohere together and we're going to stop the war. And so the idea that we don't do human sacrifice is ridiculous. Human sacrifice is still there, but if we don't understand it, then we do it without knowing that's what we're doing. And then we enter into narratives of human sacrifice without realizing that we're doing it. And so an African-American man dies on the street, and within a few days we're saying he sacrificed himself. It was a human sacrifice. And people are running together in religious ecstasy to like celebrate and have banners and circumambulate around this human sacrifice. It's like, it's still there, but we have to understand it if we want to make the best of that pattern. Like we need to understand why that happens. Yeah. Sorry, a little dark there.
And on that light note, we'll go to lunch.